to share some of our insights and some of the data that we've been developing around where the media industries are going. And we're going to focus on particularly advertisers that are trying to reach local audiences. So we're going to talk about this from a specific perspective when we say local. We'll come to that in just a second. But if you look at the interest in addressing messages, commercial messages to audiences, we're going to talk about a $146 billion marketplace of messaging by advertisers to target local audiences. In the webinar today, I'll be joined by my colleagues Mark Frattrick and Mike Boland, who are going to talk about, boy, that's a lot of money. Where is it going? We're going to be talking about several different media platforms, and we're going to be talking about some specific business categories and some of the other big trends. In this brief overview, we're not going to be able to cover all the different media and business categories. On the BIA side, we've been specializing for a long time in radio and TV. You know, we're going to have a lot of people from those platforms on the call, and all the growth we'll be talking about, a lot of the growth will be focused on the digital platforms. So today, with our forecast, a few different things we want to talk about. The ad growth of that $146.6 billion, a lot of that growth, as you'll see from Mark and Mike, is coming from a few categories that we're talking about in terms of mobile, social, and video. And audience targeting is becoming really powerful. The technology, the data, and industry practices around that, really powerful, and that's supporting a lot of growth as advertisers are better able to target their messages and move down that consumer journey to figure out what's happening in terms of conversions and ROI. So Mike's going to talk about some of the trends we're seeing in location-targeted spending around the mobile channel. Social and video, also huge parts of the growth, all within those digital channels. And together, we view that growth of mobile, social, and video kind of collectively as a power boom. We see a lot of executions, campaign executions, leveraging those three campaign elements, mobile, social, and video. So what does this mean? That's what we're going to hear from our analysts, Mark Frattrick and Mike Boland, as we move on to talk about our forecast. And not just the data, but also some of the insights we're seeing behind the data. And on the next slide, I just want to offer a quick snapshot of some of our services. So today, we're going to be talking about our advertising forecast, and we always talk about our ad forecast in terms of what's targeting local audiences. That's within our strategic and advisory services group. Just a quick shout out to a couple of other practice areas we have. M&A and financial services, we have a whole group that covers a number of different areas in that general category of M&A and financial services. Sales consulting, we have a sales consulting practice that helps our clients on the media side. And actually we work with some brands, sort of the flip side. It's not just sales, it's also buying side around funnel strategies and business opportunities. Business and consumer research, and we do conferences. Our next conference is coming up next month. We'll say a few words about that in just a moment. So a quick snapshot of some of our practice areas, just to give a familiarity to some of those on the webinar today who may not have touched base with us with all these different areas. Okay, then the next slide, as we move ahead into the program here, we're going to be talking about advertising, and we actually have a suite of advertising services. We're going to draw across the product suite of advertising products and services that we have, but generally it breaks into two types of forecasts. One forecast, it's a little bit confusing, but we call it kind of a national forecast, and that's just the aggregate of all the spending across the individual markets in the U.S. So when we say $146.6 billion of local advertising, that means advertising spent by all advertisers, national advertisers, regional advertisers, and local advertisers. Our distinction is that it's targeting local audiences. So we give that aggregate. Overall, what are advertising spending to reach local audiences? And then the second group of forecasts we have is around individual markets, Dayton, New York, Dallas. What's going on there? So we'll give different viewpoints of what's going on in that market in terms of media weight and mix, and also in terms of business categories. What are different business categories? So we break it into 94 different business categories to really give snapshots down to the business category level, the media platform level, and we can do that for individual markets, groups of markets, or we can roll it all up if you're doing national planning to give a U.S. kind of aggregated viewpoint. Okay, so in the forecast, we have a number of objectives. One objective is for the media clients, okay, how do I plan my sales budget? What's going on in the marketplace? So we're going to monitor the local marketplace And even though a lot of budgets may be 1 to 3 years with prioritization, we give a 5-year look ahead to give you some sense of the trends looking ahead. And some companies will do that 5-year viewpoint. And we'll do it for 12 different media categories. It's an overall assessment of the local marketplace, and we look at that by geographic markets, by different types of advertisers, national, regional, and SMB. And we've been doing forecasting. Mark's been leading up the program, and Mike has been really active in contributing a lot of the methodology there. So we have several different ways to drive our forecast, some empirical inputs, and then over the years we've come up with some insightful qualitative drivers that help produce the forecast model and the results. And that's our goal, is to help clients understand what's going to happen next. I mean, who can actually understand what's going to happen next? But we have a methodology that has withstood the test of time, and we do 2 updates each year. As we get better information, obviously we want to input that into the model and share that out with our clients. Okay, the next slide, the methodology. We have our own proprietary methods. We use secondary information. We use some primary information to produce the forecast. And we'll test it. So we'll get some preliminary results, test that out with different parts of the marketplace, and get some insights back and make some adjustments. Okay, let's move on to the next slide now. The forecast looks at a number of different media platforms, and we're going to highlight some of these today. It actually breaks out into a few subcategories. So we end up with 16 platforms overall. Direct mail, directories, and then we get into some of the digital media ones, video, television, cable, mobile, newspaper, online, out-of-home and out-of-home video, radio, and social. We'll focus on a couple of these platforms today. And then we also say within the broadcast media, radio and TV, we break that up by also their online revenue. So it's overall revenue and then the over-the-air revenue that we call out there, as well as the online revenue. Okay, moving along to the next slide. The forecast focuses around local. So let me just pause for a second here to highlight what we mean by local. Local, we consider to be any advertising platform that provides access to local audiences for national, regional, and local marketers. So for example, if you're doing a network television buy, that spending is not something we include in our forecast. It has to have some sort of geo-targeting or local designation for those audiences. And that marketplace, again, is almost $150 billion, so it's a huge marketplace. That's what I mean by local. And that would be consistent with that methodology, but it does offer some clarity into the insights and data we'll be sharing in just a moment. Okay, so moving on to the next slide, I'm going to turn it over to you now, Mark, and you can talk to us about some of the spending trends that we're seeing in local markets. Over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Rick. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the overview, and then we'll go into specifically about mobile, and Mike will talk about it. As Rick mentioned, we do cover 12 media, and those who can quickly add will see that there are 16 slices in that pie. That includes the online activity of the traditional media, where we separate those estimates both on a local and on a national basis. So here is our pie chart showing the relative shares of these 12 media and their online activities for 2016. As Rick said, nearly $150 billion. And as you can see in this for 2016, direct mail is the biggest one. And everybody, whenever they see this pie chart, is always saying, no, that can't be right. Direct mail isn't that big. Well, remember that this direct mail number also includes catalogs to mail to you, because that obviously is very geo-targeted to your address, as well as all of the direct solicitations. And I challenge anybody to go to their mailbox today and see whether or not they got 2 or 3 solicitations for new credit cards today. I know I certainly get a lot of them every day. So that's why direct mail is such a large amount. Television over the air is a big player this year, and that is driven in large part by political advertising, both on the various primary states, as well as Senate and gubernatorial races, and Olympic advertising for 2016. The other thing I'll point out is that online interactive, those are the pure plays, those are the Google AdWords purchases. Those are various other types of online sites not associated with traditional media, but already it's high up there at the top 3 or 4 among local media. And the last thing I'll point out, and Mike will obviously drive this home in a very big way, is that mobile is already 7.7% of all total local advertising revenues. And this has shown a remarkable growth, and I will point out that we expect this growth to continue very strongly over the next 4 or 5 years. I'd like to move to the next slide. The mobile is part of a trend that we see and have been seeing for several years of the movement towards online digital. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody on the phone, but we see this continually to increase, where overall they're going to get that online digital media advertising platforms continue to grow at a double-digit rate over the next 5 years, whereas the traditional media actually shows a slight decrease over the next 5 years. And that's in large part driven by a lot of the print traditional media, the yellow pages, magazines, and newspapers. But by 2018, you will see that online digital takes up over 1/3 of all local advertising, and we expect that percentage to continue to grow as demonstrated in this chart and obviously in years beyond. So moving to the next slide. I'm going to turn this over to Mike Boland, our VP of Content at BIA/Kelsey, who had a real strong expertise in the mobile arena.
Thank you, Mark. So now I'm going to spend, 6 or 7 minutes drilling down into the mobile portion of the forecast, and this really builds from what Mark and Rick were talking about. And the best place to start is to first provide a little bit of context of where these numbers come from. I get asked a lot about how we come up with these mobile figures, and it's a pretty rigorous process that's been developed over years. And I first developed this forecast model around 2009 when we first started forecasting mobile ad revenues, and it continues to evolve as the mobile ad market itself is evolving so rapidly. So we have a rather complex model with several spreadsheet tabs and thousands of active cells, and we essentially look at all of the different mobile ad formats that I'm going to go over in just a minute. And we look at the unique ways that those formats are bought and sold, so search and display and SMS and others, and we build models for each of these formats based on those components, and then we plug in the constantly changing inputs in mobile ad marketplaces. So for example, what's a mobile CPM for display these days, or what's a mobile cost per click for search ads, and what are the performance deltas in all of these ad formats when they're targeted locally. So lots of different inputs to build the top-down forecasting methodology, and that's then vetted against a bottom-up approach that applies sort of a gut check by looking at the revenues of the biggest players in the space, deriving mobile revenues like Google and Facebook and Twitter and YP and others. And then we finalize the numbers accordingly. And as a final note here, we don't include tablets in the mobile figures, which is something I won't go into now, but there are well-founded reasons for that, which I've covered in depth on the BIA/Kelsey blog, and you can email me if you want further explanation about that. But if we go to the next slide, one other important definition before I go into the numbers is what is location-targeted mobile ad revenue and how is that defined? Rick went over a great definition of our overall kind of viewpoint of what is local, and this is kind of the drilling down into the kind of mobile version of that definition. And first it's important to note that it includes both national and local advertisers, as Rick also mentioned. It's mostly the former, the big guys at the moment, but it's increasingly moving down market to SMBs. And at a campaign level, we define location-targeted mobile advertising in a few ways. And one, the most prevalent way that it's known is if there's a location-targeted component to the ad placement itself. So in mobile, the translation there is, is it placed within a geofence to reach consumers based on their geographic location? And then from there, location targeting can really branch out into a number of different developing tactics that we're tracking. For example, there's location-based audience targeting, which essentially tracks users and develops profiles as a function of the places that those users visit, and then targeting them on a subsequent basis based on those behavioral profiles. There's also geo-specific ad copy or creative that's localized in order to appeal to users that have an affinity for certain cities or neighborhoods. There's also the presence of location-specific calls to action that show up in ad units, such as a local phone number or directions or dynamic distance feed within a display ad unit, for example. And then within search, we're looking at things like the presence of geo-modifiers in the search term itself, or other ways that search engines like Google are defining local intent. So if we go on to the next slide, moving on to the numbers, with those methodology and definitional notes out of the way, we see location-targeted mobile advertising in the U.S. growing from $8.5 billion this year to $11.3 billion next year. And our forecast actually measures out to 2020, but today we're highlighting this year and mostly next year, 2016. So if we go to the next slide, this really puts those figures more into perspective in terms of how the location-targeted mobile ad totals we just saw compare to overall U.S. mobile ad revenues. So the blue bars you see here on this chart are the same as the blue bars of the previous slide. So as you can see, location-targeted mobile ads are a subset of the overall U.S. ad pie and currently make up about 37% of that total, growing to 39% next year. And we have that continuing to grow to about 43% by 2020, though that's not shown here in this slide. Now, the drivers for that growth include a few important factors. So first, mobile usage is really the foundation, and it indexes high for local intent. In search, for example, about half of mobile queries have local intent. Second is that advertisers are slowly catching up with those usage realities, just as ad spend generally is a trailing indicator of eyeballs. Another important factor is that localized mobile ads perform better as a result of their more targeted and relevant placement. So those higher performance metrics, such as click-through rates, are boosting these dollar amounts we're looking at here and also creating higher premiums. And then lastly, as advertiser demand kind of follows all of this and continues to grow for location-targeted ads, it puts even more upward pressure on ad rates. So for example, in search, you have bid marketplaces that follow basic supply and demand principles, and prices go up when demand does and when supply gets scarcer. So all of those factors lead to some of the figures you see here and also the growth we're projecting all the way out to 2020. So if we go to the next slide, here's another interesting segmentation. So what we're looking at here is the location-targeted mobile ad spend we already saw, but now subdivided by ad format. And the clear winner here is search, and that has a lot to do with its intent-driven and pull-based nature that causes higher performance and premiums in some of the ways I just described. But another key takeaway I want to highlight here is the rise of native social. So a couple of years ago, this category wasn't even on this chart, and it's quickly rising to prominence and will grow even further out to 2020. And what we're talking about here are ads that are placed within the feed-based interfaces of social apps. So they're not obtrusive or interruptive banners, they're more merged within the social content in native ways. So we're talking about Facebook newsfeed ads, which you've probably seen, or Twitter promoted tweets, or Pinterest's viable pins. And these are all increasingly in-demand and high-performing ad units. And that's partially because of their native and integrated format, and partly because of the finely tuned targeting algorithms that companies like Facebook are applying based on the behavioral and social signals of the social graph. We're also seeing things like action buttons sprout up all over these native ad units, like buy buttons and other buttons that drive offline local conversions, like Facebook's call button, which we're seeing more and more of in the wild, or launching a message window to a local business through Facebook Messenger. That's something we're going to see grow as well. So these are all things that are somewhat nascent but growing quickly, especially among millennials. So this will be something to watch closely and will mostly take a bite out of traditional display. I think that's going to be really the victim of native social's growth, traditional display, which is really defined by more traditional static banner ads, which I'm actually pretty bearish on. as things develop. So winding down here, I guess I'll put a period there. Those are just a few of my takeaways from the mobile forecasting. There's, of course, a lot more to it that's in our full forecast, including kind of other takeaways and outer years building up to 2020, as I alluded to. But hopefully that's a valuable taste. And speaking of social, I guess I'll kick it back to Mark to drill down on the social media portion of the forecast. So, Mark, back to you.
Thank you, Mike, and that's a great segue into our social media forecast, where we make estimates of the actual social spending. Next slide, please. And I think it's very important to define it. You see the definition of social media advertising across social networks. It's included in various other parts of our forecast, but we separated in the following data slide, and we discuss it in extensive in our full forecast. It's also very important to highlight what's not included in it. It doesn't include any social virtual currency, any marketing measurement platforms and services, and certainly nothing involving social commerce. Next slide, please. With that in mind, here are our total social advertising spending and the different components of it between national and local targeting that Rick and Mike had defined. We see it growing just from 2015 to next year by approximately 30% to over $12 billion. And you can see that the local aspect of it is 3.3, actually grows at a faster rate than the overall rate. So local is becoming much more important, as Mike was referring to before in his mobile forecast. Next slide. And this shouldn't come at any surprise to anybody on the phone. This is our breakout of total social media advertising by the various big players. And while there are more and more players coming in, you know, we talk about Pinterest, Tumblr, and Foursquare, among others, Facebook still dominates this marketplace insofar as having over 3/4 of the total social media advertising. And while those other companies will grow as they monetize their audiences more, and LinkedIn and Twitter will grow, we tell you that we actually expect Facebook to maintain that relative share of nearly 3/4 going forward in the social media advertising. The various options that they now have on their plate, as well as their other new advertising vehicles, allows them to continue to dominate this marketplace. Next slide, please. I'm going to turn to another important area that we see in our advertising forecast, and that has to do with local video. And that has 5 different components of it. There's a lot of traditional local video, local television stations, local cable. Out of home is also an interesting area for local video, where you have in elevators, you have in taxi cabs, you have in digital advertising and movie theaters. This is all out of home video advertising. 2 more prominent places in terms of growth is online and mobile, and both of those are going to show remarkable growth over the next few years. Next slide. What are the trends overall in this area? Well, obviously, local television stations still are a big dominant player in the local video marketplace, and especially in 2016, as I made reference to before, in terms of the political advertising. Local cable systems also continue to make strong growth, and they too are benefiting from the even number of years with the increased political advertising, especially on local campaigns, wherein local cable systems can target a little bit more narrowly than local television stations. Online video has been very strong in recent years, and we expect that to continue. The out-of-home video showed strong growth several years ago, but that growth is starting to slow as it matures. And certainly mobile video, as Mike showed before, that's a small slice of the overall mobile advertising pie, but we expect that to grow at the ability to geo-target in a really finely tuned manner allows you in that venue. Going to the next slide, you can see these growth rates from 2015 through 2016. And the big blue group box in the bottom is obviously local television. And that over $2 billion growth between the years is primarily driven by political advertising and some Olympic advertising. Cable also will see some increase in 2016, and the other categories will increase, and some at some substantial rates. Mobile video growing from 400 million to over 700 million in that 1 year alone. What does that mean for the overall competitive landscape in the local video marketplace? Next slide, please. Here's our breakout of that advertising revenue, and you can see because of the political year, local television still dominates at over 3/4 of the total local video advertising revenue, with cable was slightly over 1/5. I'll point out that the mobile video and the online video are the small slices of this pie, but by 2020, they'll be in the 4 to 5 or even 6% range of the total local video advertising. So these are areas that traditional media companies have to be aware of their growing dominance, their growing presence in the marketplace. Next slide, please. I want to turn quickly to our online numbers. Our online numbers include the pure plays and search numbers, as well as display numbers. Next slide, please. And local search as well as local display are growing, though, at a much slower rate than we witnessed earlier in this decade, and certainly in the 2000s. But we see local search growing by over $400 million just between the 2 years, and that's a strong growth rate, but certainly lower than what we have seen in previous years. And then what Mike mentioned before, a lot of that local search is mobile driven and very geo-targeted. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn it over to Rick here now to sort of recap some of our findings.
Great, thank you, Mark. So a couple quick summary points here, and obviously there's a lot more depth in here. Total local advertising, and that means advertising targeting local audiences from all buyers, national, regional, local. It's going to reach $146 billion, up from $143.3 billion this year. The growth, as you've heard from Mark and Mike, is going to be really centralized around the online and digital categories. We see that growing to $42.6 billion in 2016, 29.1% of total local media revenue, up from $38 billion in 2015. For 2016, we're also going to expect to see local ad revenues nudge upward, resulting both from a stronger lift from an overall economy, as well as Mark pointed out in the even years we get political and maybe Olympic advertising that gives a little bit of a lift, more so to some media than others. Mobile social video, what we call the power brew, that is kind of the epicenter of a lot of the growth engine here overall, and then specifically, of course, in digital. Okay, next slide. Mark and Mike, why don't I ask you guys to come back and just kind of put a little emphasis on a couple of things that you guys are talking about. Mark, why don't you start us off?
Sure, I will, Rick. The media marketplace, that pie chart that we started off our discussion, our presentation with, it's an ever-changing landscape. I mean, the pie chart looks so dramatically different 2 or 3 years ago, and new options come in every day. Actually, we hear about new companies given our presence in this area, new opportunities for advertisers to reach their local audiences, whether very geo-targeted or not. But we obviously highlighted in this webinar the power brew that Rick referred to as the mobile, social, online video type of power brew, and that we think that those are the real strong growth areas over the next few years. Mike?
Yeah, so I mentioned briefly kind of the rise of native social, and that might come at the cost of static banner ads or what we call traditional display. And really the background there is that, 7% of U.S. consumer spending happens online. So the mobile opportunity isn't about clicks and e-commerce the way it was in the desktop kind of display-centric world. We believe the bigger payout is really going to be in connecting the dots between mobile engagement and offline action. And that's everything from, summoning an Uber to calling a locksmith to, messaging a restaurant to make a reservation over Facebook Messenger, or placing your Starbucks coffee order and paying for it before you get there, and all of these other use cases that are really developing where it's possible to drive and track and report that offline attribution where, again, most U.S. consumer spending happens. So that, in basic terms, is going to be, I think, the winning formula for mobile ad and mobile local product models in the next few years.
Yeah, and while we emphasizing the mobile, the social, and online video advertising opportunities that are new and growing, we also want to point out that traditional media are still very relevant in local media marketplaces, and it's still relevant in overall advertising mixes. So these other traditional media play possibly a different role for advertisers in getting their type overall message out, and many of them work very complementary to the online digital opportunities that are now available.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. I mean, with traditional media, I think as humans, we're kind of optimized to pay attention to the things that move, and that's definitely the digital categories, particularly that you were talking about, Mike, and Mark, you were highlighting also. But the foundational part of any media mix, even in our forecast out to 2020, targeting local audiences, is still going to be what we're calling traditional media platforms, broadcast, newspaper, some of those kind of categories. Although actually some of the digital categories have been around long enough, so they're really traditional platforms too. So it's a media mix, and it involves both online and offline media, linear and digital media, and that's what advertisers are looking for. They want that multi-platform deployment of their campaigns, and as Mike was saying, that's something we really want to urge, that understanding of the consumer journey to purchase and that offline to online and online to offline conversion. A lot of money happens in that offline capacity, but still a ton of that decision making, even if it doesn't consummate online, is impacted by both traditional and digital media. So that's the mix in the marketplace, and when we work with our clients and conversations in the industry, we want to be attentive and capable of adapting to new options. And that's a big challenge. We can think we're attentive, but there's so much information. What do we focus on? And then to be adaptable to new options, what do we do? What makes sense? And there's a lot of different experimentation in the marketplace, a lot of mergers and acquisitions and partnerships. Those are good signs, we think, of a market trying to be close to the opportunity and the threats and evolve as the marketplace evolves to provide better service to our clients, the advertisers, and ultimately our audiences. So the next slide, let me offer a couple of thoughts here about the forecast, kind of quick wrap-up points here, how companies use our forecast, a few thoughts there. We invite you to go to the landing page there to learn more about the U.S. advertising forecast, and please feel free to contact Mark, Mike, or myself to see what kind of services we provide along with the actual numbers and the different options for the forecast. As we say, it is a suite of services. We've learned to break it out into several different kinds of views that would be interesting from different business perspectives. And then on the next slide, we are looking ahead to our conference next month in Los Angeles, December 9-10. It's going to be at the Lowe's Hollywood. We'd like to offer you a discount. Please come join us if you haven't already planned to do so. And if you have planned to do so, thank you. And again, let us know. Let Mike, Mark, and myself know about your plans to be there. And it'd be great to get together with a meeting and share some thoughts and perspectives and see what kind of discussion we get going. I do want to highlight that I'd like to offer you a couple $100 off the registration cost. When you go to register, just use that code, ADFORECAST, on that landing page, BIAKLC.com next. And thank you very much for listening so far. What we'd like to do next is open up the line and have some questions and answers. If you don't mind, as you leave the webinar, we hope you stay with us for the discussion, but if you do need to leave, please also look for that poll pop up. I'd like to get some feedback from you so we can understand how to make these webinars more compelling for you. We hope we're on the mark this time, but we always challenge ourselves to do better. So one of the first questions that came in, Mike, is going to be for you. You were making some comments about display advertising, and certainly relative to some of the other digital categories, you're saying that you're maybe a bit bearish on that. So when you say display, the question is, can you define a little bit more what you mean by that? Is that just static? Does it get into some of the like slideshow kind of inventory, or what exactly do you mean by display?
Sure. So that's a good question. Display essentially is all banner advertising. It also involves some of those interstitial units, slideshows, things like that. It's the catch-all for everything except what we are kind of putting aside as this new category of native social. And what defines native social is essentially in-feed ad units. So one defining factor is the actual placement in the format. So it's usually textual. It can have some images. It also can have some video. Facebook and others are getting into native video ad units. But the largest kind of defining or identifying factor of native social is that it is integrated in feed-based social media rather than an obtrusive banner that's on the top or the bottom of the screen. Now, another important identifying factor besides that format is also the targeting parameters. So ads that are targeted based on social signals, so who your friends are, what they've liked, all the kind of valuable kind of behavioral data and social signals that networks like Facebook are developing. And in addition to kind of within their own feeds and on Facebook proper and on Instagram, you see networks like Facebook start to go off-site. So Facebook's Facebook Audience Network is starting to apply those same principles on third-party apps, and that's another reason we're going to really see it grow. But to answer the question about really what defines that type of advertising, traditional display is really kind of everything except what we're calling this newer category of native social in the ways I explained.
That includes animated, rich media display ads in that display banner format. But you mentioned video too could be included, like in Facebook sponsored news feeds. One of the growth categories in terms of ad units is video. And then, Mark, you were also talking about video. How do we understand the opportunity for marketing around video, display video versus full-screen video or pre-roll video?
It's a combination of all of them, obviously, but we're very bullish on the display video, the pre-roll, as well as the in-program online video advertising that is local targeted. Remember, we're not talking about the advertising that is just going on, let's say, a Netflix or a CBS.com, but advertising advertising that is very geo-targeted. But increasingly, a lot of the online network video advertising is targeting. I think, Rick, you had a panel a few months ago where 30% of Hulu's advertising is location targeted, local advertising, and so that's a very big growth area where we see advertisers going through these alternative means of distribution of video and utilizing those advertising vehicles as well.
Right, and so Kristen Nook from Hulu spoke at one of our conferences, and actually we have John Paul Rexing from ESPN Hometown who's going to elaborate on that theme about getting those geo-targeted audiences for national advertisers. So at our conference next month, we're definitely going to pick up on that theme specifically with a couple of different speakers and sessions. One thing a number of people have been asking, will the deck be available afterwards? And yes, for those of you who missed the front part of the webinar, we'll have the webinar on demand, plus the deck will be available, and we'll send an email around to that effect of where to locate those assets tomorrow morning sometime. And then we have some questions. I guess I'll put them in two different categories, Mike and Mark. One is, we talked about some of the overall things, traditional versus digital. but there's some questions. What about the individual media platforms, radio, TV, newspaper? Any thoughts about those particular platforms? And then, Mark, you had mentioned that in 2016, that's a political year, so we're expecting to see a bump. Do we break out any viewpoint of political forecast separately, or is that just sort of a driver in the overall forecast? Maybe start first with the political market.
Yeah, it's a good question that comes up a lot when I discuss the revenues, especially in the even number years, because political is so dominant in many local markets. We don't separate or make a separate estimate for political. I have seen numbers in the $2.5–3 billion range. For one reason we don't separate it is because sometimes in several markets, political actually crowds out other local advertising. So a local retailer in a hot Senate race or a battleground state next year in 2016 may find it difficult to get enough airtime on their local television station, especially if they want to advertise in the news portion of news programming, which is very heavy with political ads. So we believe that you should look at the TV market in its entirety, and that overall the core business is pretty consistent in television advertising, and it has been for several years. You get the ups and downs from the even number years, but generally local television has been progressing at a 3–3.5% rate as you move from over the longer term, as you smooth out the spikes in the even number years. With respect to radio, unfortunately radio doesn't generate the political advertising that local TV stations has. So they don't get the big bumps. They get, in some areas they will get some political advertising, but we see radio in 2016 at a very meager 1–1.25% increase. Radio facing incredible competition from streaming services and the many other local media that we demonstrate there. I think that answers that question.
Great, thank you. And then, so we talk about growth. Is that coming from more spend per client in advertising across these different platforms, or do we see more businesses doing the spending? Any sense as to the relative mix on the buy side of what's going on?
The answer to that question is yes and yes. There is new businesses getting started. We do a lot of surveying of small and medium businesses in our local commerce monitor survey we conduct every year, and we see their advertising growing, as well as a number of small and medium businesses increasing every year. And as those small and medium businesses grow themselves, they tend to start spending a lot on online digital. But as they mature and grow their sales, they actually move into some of the traditional media areas and utilize those as part of their advertising mixes. So there's increased advertising spending as the economy continues to grow, as well by individual advertisers, as well as new advertisers always coming in and trying to reach their local audiences.
So, Mike, I want to ask you a question that was posed to us. It's actually probably combining a couple of different questions, but for the Power Brew, you're forecasting some nice uplift there in terms of spend. And one of the questions is effectiveness. I mean, so we see the spend shift. Overall, economy is growing. Advertising tends to leg the economy in and out. But so we expect some uplift in advertising as well. And within that uplift, more spending, new spending, and shifted spending is going to happen in that set of Power Brew platforms of social mobile video. Interesting, but is that effective? I mean, there's just some evidence that that's wise spend by advertisers. What does that look like? And then maybe back to you, Mark, after my comments on that. From the traditional media platforms, that's still over, it's about two-thirds of the spend, I guess, still. What can traditional media players do with the Power Brew? Can they also sell that, and does that give even better results for advertisers? But first, like the Power Brew, is there evidence that actually works, in addition to seeing the growth in ad spend?
Sure. So I think you're asking about campaign and ad effectiveness and performance, and I'll break that down into a few different components that we're seeing. So within mobile, when location targeting is done right, we see a clear increase in KPIs such as click-through rates, or in what we call secondary actions, which frankly are more important, given what I mentioned earlier about more things happening offline. And we say secondary action, what we mean is not just a click, but after that, an actual follow-up, such as launching directions or launching a phone call to the business, or reserving something, or scheduling an appointment, or some other more tangible kind of more tangible action on that path to purchase. So what we're seeing is when targeting is done right, when the right calls to action are included, when best practices are followed, we are certainly seeing up to 10x increases in performance over campaigns that don't execute those best practices, or desktop benchmarks. We're certainly seeing a great deal more performance that's certainly proving out. Now, another interesting area is mobile video. So among the last few questions, one of the things that was a common thread to me as I was listening was video, and mobile video is interesting, and we're seeing a lot of performance deltas there as well, because the mobile usage is certainly trending towards video. It's interesting, if you look at some of the data that Mark showed earlier in the overall video market, mobile had a relatively low share, but I think that's really because we're in early stages of the ad market growth, where the usage is ramping, but the ad dollars haven't caught up, mostly because it's still nascent and ad models haven't been developed or proven. So the advertiser demand is still relatively low, but if you look at some of the leading indicators that could predict that ad growth, you see things such as mobile usage among millennials, you see better mobile broadband, better connectivity that's conducive to mobile consumption of video, bigger smartphone screens on average to view that video content, and better optics to capture and share it. The iPhone 6S has a 12 megapixel camera. So a lot of drivers on the usage end that are leading indicators, we believe, of higher performance, back to your question, and then overall ad growth in mobile video.
Let me answer the question you had of me, Rick, in terms of traditional media still being a very relevant player, and how traditional media can capitalize on the strong growth that we foresee in the online digital. It's true, traditional media it's still very important, and it just has to be thought of as part of an advertising mix. That different media has different roles in getting the advertising message out to consumers, whether it's an image with a television or a humorous radio spot, and supplemented with a more targeted type of message, call to action, as Mike refers to a lot in mobile ads discussion. I mean, it's a blended mix of different types of vehicles. And the other thing that's very important, as you made reference to, is the ability of traditional local media outlets to capitalize on this. One thing that's often overlooked is the fact that traditional media has the boots on the ground, has a local sales staff, has the relationship with these advertisers for many, many years. And many broadcasters and many local newspapers are capitalizing on that and going out with what we refer to as four-legged sales calls, where you would have a traditional seller along with somebody who also is more skilled in the online digital opportunity. So it really is something that we see encouraging for local traditional media outlets being able to move beyond just their traditional sphere and moving into new areas.
So Mark, you mentioned feet on the street. Let me pick up on that theme. And this kind of crosses between strength of traditional media platforms like you're talking about have those deployed feet on the street, whereas some of the digital media platforms don't have that same, really locally deployed sales force. So one of the questions we have in is from the YP segment, and so they're have been facing changes in their marketplace on the print side, getting more into the digital kinds of categories of ad units. But there's also within that industry segment, you've got the bigger players, the YPs, the Dexes, the Haibus, that have maybe embraced digital strategies much more so than the smaller print publishers. Can you, Mark and Mike, talk to us a little bit more about what you're seeing in that YP segment of the marketplace?
Yeah, that's very encouraging, and maybe because the print yellow pages were threatened early on by the online digital opportunities, or maybe it's just because of the forward-thinking ability of the executives at the directory companies. They entered into this marketplace, the online digital marketplaces, very early on, and developed a suite of services that we now refer to as Internet Yellow Pages, but that doesn't give it enough justice in terms of all the various opportunities they provide. So they have local salespeople, they have local solutions, and they obviously know some of the advertisers and what their spends have been in the past, and so they're able to offer a whole suite of new services. And we see that a lot with a lot of the names that you mentioned, the DEX, YP, and Haibu, the larger companies who saw this coming down and are moving into these areas in dramatic fashions.
Great. Mike, one of the issues with digital, especially in the recent general press, even not even just the trade press, is around this notion of challenges like ad blocking, viewability, brand safety kind of things. So we see a lot of growth happening in digital ad spend from the advertiser's perspective and revenue from the media perspective. Tell us a little bit about what you're seeing with some of these issues like ad blocking, brand safety, viewability. How much is that impacting the potential growth opportunities in digital with different categories?
Sure, I'll take those one by one. So brand safety is a key issue, especially as things are moving more towards some of the social native things I mentioned earlier. It requires brands to go about it with a slightly different mindset in seeding some control that they've traditionally locked down in their brand messaging, because it's really crowdsourcing the communication of a message, of people using your brand and positioning it in certain ways. That's certainly risky, and I think that brand safety is a key issue. Ad blocking is actually a topic that I've been kind of almost laughing at for the past few months. There's been a lot of hand-wringing and misunderstanding of this new kind of batch of ad blockers, and a lot of it, in my opinion, has really been overblown, and a lot of link bait headlines, which is kind of bound to happen anyway. But if we kind of do the reality check, one, ad blockers don't currently work within apps. They work within mobile web only, and that's an important point because apps are where the majority of mobile time is spent and where the majority of display ads are shown, and lots of other ad units. So ad blockers also require manual download and activation, which most mobile users just won't get around to doing when it comes down to it. The ad blockers also are only compatible with iOS 9 and within the Safari browser and on 64-bit devices, which is essentially newer iPhones. So if you add up all of these conditions and variables, the actual volume of ads that are eligible to be blocked whittle down to about 3%, according to UBS, and some of the math I've done as well. So, ad blockers, they really won't have the impact that a lot of people are saying. I think if they do have any psychological impact, I think it'll be a good thing in forcing lazy advertisers to innovate beyond some of the things that I mentioned earlier, traditional display, creating more compelling and native ad formats that people will engage with and not see as obtrusive. So, for example, that could involve the growth of the native social formats I went over earlier, and that have less obtrusive placement because they're placed in feed. So essentially, if ad blockers have any impact in the long term, it'll be positive and evolutionary for the industry, and it won't be its death knell. So don't believe all those ominous headlines you see is my takeaway.
Great. Well, I'm going to ask you have something to say, Mark? Mike and Mark, I was going to ask you to give just a final thought. I think we've got through a lot of the questions, and if we do, we're going to go through the list of questions that came in, and we'll follow up by email to make sure that we get answers back to you. But as we close out, again, remember we're going to have a poll pop up, so as you leave, please respond to that poll and help us out so we can better understand how to serve you. But just before we end, I thought I'd give Mark and Mike, you each just a few seconds to see if there's any final thoughts you have.
I'll start. Rick, I think we covered a lot of different aspects of what we refer to as the power brew and how that interrelates with other media other advertising platforms, and has been referenced before, we go into a lot more detail on each and every media in the full forecast, and obviously are always available to follow up questions, either from this webinar or if you get the full forecast. We can spend some time with you and explaining some of our thoughts on these other media.
And Mike, one thing I do want to emphasize is that, Mike, you do a great job editing our newsletter and do a lot of contributions on our blog. We have a free newsletter. You might just say a word about that for people that aren't familiar with how to get a hold of that. And then any other final thoughts, Mike?
Sure. So first, the newsletter, you can find that on our website. There's links all over the place, and it's a really good kind of wrap-up of the things that we're seeing and doing and hearing on a weekly basis. It comes out every Thursday. A lot of good information in there. As a concluding point, what I'd like to focus on is to respond to the question about kind of YPs and what they've done over the last half decade or so in terms of innovation and other things, because I think that provides some interesting lessons and takeaways. So in terms of the YPs and what they've done, their strengths, I fully agree that their feet on the street and their organization, their sales organizations are very robust. In terms of their digital innovation for products, frankly, as an industry, I think they get a failing grade relative to all of the innovation we're seeing from startups. Now, I don't say that to completely slam on them, because I sympathize with the innovator's dilemma that a lot of traditional media companies face as they're moving into sometimes lesser margin online, digital, or mobile products. And I think one of the success factors we've seen from companies that have handled that innovator's dilemma and moved forward with the most success are those that actually spin off separate divisions that aren't hampered by some of that organizational inertia and innovator's dilemma. A few good examples of that are Deseret Media. YP is actually an interesting example of that, in that they were born, or I guess looped out of what was originally an innovation lab at AT&T Interactive, and I think a lot of the innovation they've done since then is a result of that kind of organizational structure as one way to kind of thrive with a lot of the digital media that we've talked about here today.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much for being with us today. Happy Veterans Day for those of you who are working. So are we, obviously. Thanks for being with us. And hope to see you at our conference next month in December. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Mark. Take care, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.